speaker, Jeannine Fletcher, is a constructive theologian, writing at the intersections of Catholic, systematic theology, and issues of diversity.
Do you have a microphone?
Do we have a mic? Jeannine is the author of The Sin of White Supremacy, Christianity, Racism, and Religious Diversity in America, published by Orbis in 2017. As professor of theology at Fordham University, Jeannine also serves on the board of the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, an intergenerational, multiracial, multi-religious, grassroots organization committed to racial justice and economic democracy in New York City and beyond. Her new book, entitled Grace of the Ghosts, A Theology of Institutional Reparation, is forthcoming next spring. A native of suburban Chicago, Jeannine attended St. Ignatius College Prep and worked with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps after graduating from the University of Illinois. Her graduate school training took her to Boston, and she settled into teaching theology at Fordham. She started in 2001. She has written about life as an academic and mother in her 2013 book, Motherhood and Metaphor. Jeannine has 3 children, 2 in college, 1 in high school. This is not Jeannine's first trip. First trip to Cleveland. In fact, her dad was a student at St. Ignatius High School. And she took frequent trips to Harlem to visit her beloved grandmother, Lucille Hill. Cleveland holds a special place in her heart. Please welcome Jeannine Hill.
Thank you to Patrick and thank you to the committee for welcoming me. Thank you also to Barb for hosting and showing me around. Thank you to all of you who have gathered and anyone who can actually hear us. If we're Zooming, I'm not sure. I'll try to keep my voice up. If it's about right, let me know. If it gets too loud in the front, let me know that as well. And I also want to thank all of you for joining this evening. Much of my work is spent in the classroom of young people in college or in the library, and sometimes I kind of put the pieces together and say, okay, does this land, right? How does this land, given your own background, given your own experience? So when Pat and I talked about how we might structure this evening, we thought maybe that I would try to keep the first part of what I'm offering to about 25 minutes, and then have some Q&A and conversation and see how it's landing, right? And then I said 10, but I think it's 12 or 15, that I'll bring the history that I'm doing a little bit, I think, closer geographically to home, and then we'll have more time for Q&A, and I've asked Patrick to cut us off, because I'll just keep going on this stuff. So, we're here with a pretty heavy topic, and I really appreciate that you're up for the challenge of us thinking through some things together. But I wanted to start with, and make sure if at any point you can't see the visuals here, let me know. I thought I would start with a theoretical framing. First, I'm going to turn on my timer so that I stick to that time that I promised. There we go. I want to start with a theoretical framing, and the proposal here, right? The proposal that racism, or what I am comfortable naming as systems of white supremacy, but I'll leave it as racism for now. My proposal is that racism is a national historic trauma, right? And I frame it that way following Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and she has written and spoken about this idea as she's working with indigenous communities. And the way that she defines historic trauma, I think, is apt to the reality of racism in our nation's history. That is, the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. Right? I'm thinking with this theoretical framing both to try to capture the impact of structures, systems, ideologies of white supremacy as they have landed on people, racialized as other in our nation's history. But I also think that it might be productive and theoretically fruitful to think about the ways that white people and people who have been racialized as white also approach racism and often aren't able to articulate, right, our own feelings about that national history. So I'm sort of testing out whether racism as a national historic trauma, whether that fits. Right? Does that fit? Is that helpful to us? Right? To recognize the ways that we see it as psychological wounding across generations, but in naming it as trauma, we recognize that sometimes, right, the approach to trauma is to kind of brush it aside, to keep it hidden. Okay. So we'll see if that works. One of the other reasons that I think that it is a helpful theoretical frame for me is that Braveheart proposes a cycle of steps as she works with indigenous people who have she's working with indigenous communities, right, that are experiencing this ongoing trauma, this historic trauma, right, and she's asking indigenous communities to be able to confront that history and understand it in order to release the pain, right, in order to transcend the trauma. And I follow the work of the Jesuit Indian school Red Cloud, right, and their adaptation of this circle. And I'm testing it out to see if it helps, right? Not only from the perspective of those who have been impacted by this national trauma of racism, but by those who are in the legacy of perpetrators, right? So I'm asking that question of myself and of my audience, but I have found it really helpful, right, to think about the possibility of addressing racism as a historical trauma and following these steps and really saying we need to start with what Braveheart names as the importance of confrontation or truth-telling, right? We'll unpack that from a variety of places, but I want you to think about, right? Is there a way in which the national historic trauma of racism and white supremacy has been a reality that many generations have simply refused to tell the truth about this reality? And is that a necessary first step? What Braveheart then goes on to do is say, look, that's an important first step, but we also have to do that in order to move toward analysis, in order to understand, right, what has gone on in our history, and then to see if we can move toward transcending the trauma. And those second two pieces we can come back to, because much of what I want to talk about today is really to ask the question whether when I say we, at this point, I'm thinking about the focus that that Patrick and I agreed on in terms of thinking about racism and the role of Catholic communities, Catholic individuals, Catholic institutions in our national history, right? So when I'm thinking with the Catholic community and Catholic history, have we understood, right, the role that Catholics, the role that the Catholic Church, the role that Catholic communities have played in our history, right, in our national history of racism and white supremacy. So I'm starting with this first moment and really making the proposal that we really haven't done this work. But that's a question I'd like to ask you, right? As I try to make my way through this history rather speedily in the time that's available to us, I want you to ask yourself, do I know this history? Right? Is this part of how we understand ourselves as American Catholics already? Right? Or is this history something that we might say, maybe I knew something about that, but I'm not sure I ever got the full picture. Okay, so that's where I'm starting. The question, what is the history of the American Catholic Church in relationship to racism? Right? Big question, long history, and what I have done is I have found it helpful to navigate that through 3 overlapping eras. So the first, as you'll see, is the encounter with indigenous people. The second is entanglement in an economy of enslavement. And the third is the entrenchment in the protection of white interests. Right? That's the roadmap for where we're going. With me so far? Yes. Okay. Do we, and all the way through, do we know this history? Right? Okay. So, with our first component here, the encounter with indigenous people. Let's see how I'm doing in my pace here, in my time. So, I have a map from an indigenous organizer, right, who is making available at tribalmaps.com, I think is the site, but just making available a visual reminder. I'll zoom in a little bit closer, and then I will be making these available somehow that you will have these slides that you can click on all the links that are included here. But just a visual of the many nations and tribes and languages and cultures that populated what many indigenous people will call Turtle Island, right? And that the initial encounter of the Catholic Church in this geography, right, was an encounter that was driving forward an idea of Christendom, right? Christian expansion, Christian missionary activity is sort of at any cost, right? This sense of the pursuit of what the Catholic Church understood as a value, right? To bring the gospel to all nations. But in the original encounter, right? From the moment of the original encounter to the experience of the indigenous communities today, right? We have to think about that history under this long arc of devastation, right? The loss of indigenous culture, the loss of indigenous language, indigenous religion, etc., right? And I have offered 3 different places that I would root this era in 3 very critical moments of the Catholic Church's involvement in the encounter with indigenous people. Right? Some folks may have heard of the work that's being done around this doctrine of discovery, right? And the doctrine of discovery is a term that's used to try to capture the way in which the popes of the 15th century, right, looked out on all of the globe and drew a line of demarcation and said, hey, Portugal, you have that half, Spain, you have that half, go and Christianize the world, right? It became a political doctrine. It became a principle under which the exploring nations of Europe said, okay, if we arrive and we don't find a Christian nation already there, we have the right to claim that land, right? This idea that that land was uninhabited, right? There were no Christians there, so we can claim it. But if we arrive and find another Christian nation there, right, the agreement was hands off, right? That the original nation, the original Christian nation, could hold title to the land. What indigenous organizers tried to draw our attention to is that although this had a political root in Catholic teaching, right, about Christianization, about missionization, it became a lasting legal doctrine as it became part of the U.S. legal system in 1823 with Johnson versus McIntosh. And all the way from 1823 till today, even within the last, I think it's 15 years, I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg looked back and made claims about the doctrine of discovery that would have impact on tribal nations today and their lack of sovereignty, right? So this initial Catholic moment, right, of missionization and colonization has lasting impact to today, but we could intervene in this longer history right, to look at the ways in which the Catholic Church in various parts of the nation, right, might have had influence, might have had involvement in, right, all the way through these several hundred years, the expanding of white interests, the expanding of white claims to land, and the various broken treaties that we see throughout this history. I don't have too much to say about that intervening moment, but that probably could expand, and we could look at a lot of different local Catholic histories that might be incorporated there. The third point that I have in thinking about the American Catholic Church and the encounter with indigenous people has to do with the history of Catholic Indian boarding schools, right? The way in which part of missionization as we move into the 19th and 20th century was mission to the indigenous people, but it was mission to the indigenous people that extracted the young people from their communities and sometimes forcibly brought them to Catholic boarding schools and other boarding schools. And so the project of family separation, the project of cultural erasure that was part of the project of Catholic mission in boarding schools, have we wrestled with that history? Do we vaguely know the history? Have we wrestled with the history? Right, so part of this is kind of thinking about how we sort of vaguely, I don't know, I want to ask, and then I'm like, I'm going to get off time. Do we know this history? Sort of, right? Do we wrestle with this history? Right, I'm going off time, so just make sure I come back. I'm working on a project right now with women religious, the nuns, right? And they are partnering with young organizers, the nuns, the ones that have no affiliation, right? And they're working together and thinking about land justice, returning land, right? Returning land that the sisters hold to the original keepers of the land, indigenous communities. And in one of these Zoom encounters, a woman a little older than me, but not by much, that she herself had been educated in a Catholic boarding school. At 14, she ran away from the boarding school. And as we were sitting together with a longer version of this history, just the sense that she kind of vaguely knew this and then realized, like, this seems to have been a project attempting to erase my humanity. Right? And so this sense that this is a history that's out there, but it's a history that shapes our nation and shapes indigenous people and it shapes indigenous Catholics, but it also should be shaping all of us in thinking about, okay, have we reckoned with that? Is there a repair that we can envision? Right? And I think that land justice initiative is among the repairs that are envisioned. I include here, it's from the Canadian context, but it's a new documentary from National Geographic. It's called Sugarcane. I have not seen it yet, but the fact that National Geographic is putting out a documentary means that we don't know this history, right? It means that we've refused to see it, right? Okay. Is it, I don't know what the word is it a symptom of trauma that we have refused to reckon with? Right? That's one of the questions that I have with using trauma. Okay, I'm going to look and see. I'm about halfway through, but I've not really gotten as far as I need to get, so I'm going to keep going. All right. So, this is another episode of the Catholic Church involvement with structures and systems and realities of racism in American history. It's another example of where histories are still being written, right, that show not the full effect, but that try to capture a little bit more of that reality, precisely because it has not been something that Catholics have put on the table clearly to say, yes, my tradition, my church has been part of the human devastation of an economy of enslavement. Okay. So this is part of one of the focus areas of my research, so I have a whole lot more to say, and I'm going to try to just give you my 4 bullet points here. If I was answering the question, what was the role of the American Catholic Church in an economy of enslavement, I would be guided by a young historian who is really, it's only in the last 10 years that I have heard her frame it this way, the Catholic Church being the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas. What does that mean? What do we do with that, right? So I said, okay, that's a big thing in terms of numbers. And then my own research, I've gone a little bit inside some of the argumentation in this period. So in 1839, Gregory XVI writes an apostolic letter condemning the slave trade. And the American Catholic bishops reason their way out with the best of their scholarship and the best of their tradition. They reason their way out to say, oh, Gregory means the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, we all don't want that, but the domestic practice of enslavement, he's not saying anything about that. And if you want to get a snapshot of this, the U.S. Catholic Miscellany, which is coming out of Charleston, is one of the earliest American Catholic newspapers. The bishop who oversaw that used the front page of the U.S. Catholic Miscellany for 16 weeks to explain Catholic history, Catholic doctrine, Catholic practice, right, to the Secretary of State, John Forsyth, at the time, to say, well, of course we should be allowed, right, to hold people in enslavement, right? What kind of resources go into that sort of a defense, right? Okay. Part of my study is looking at Catholic women and men who were enslavers and who were holding fellow Catholics in bondage. I don't know if I haven't found a way to articulate this last point that I'm, so those 16 letters on the front of the U.S. Catholic Miscellany. About 4 years later, a new bishop is running the paper and is responding to what appears to be kind of rumblings out among the Catholic faithful. He's responding to them. He says, okay, I've heard some rumblings. Some of you are saying that we've hidden this papal letter. Actually, he says, some of you are saying we hid this encyclical. And he says, it was just an apostolic letter. It wasn't an encyclical, right? So, okay, first point made. And then offers offers a condensed editorial that says, look, we've already made the demonstration, the proof that Catholics should be allowed to participate in an economy of enslavement. It is not contrary to our faith, right? Our faith, in fact, defends our right to do this. And he describes what was part of the Catholic imaginary at that time, that Catholic enslavers were, of course, benevolent to their enslaved people. You would not believe how many times it was regular that. Go with me on this. And at the end of this editorial, he says, not only are Catholics so good, right, at this benevolence and at training their enslaved people, that when they go to market in Maryland, they earn 20 to 25% more. I'm not lying. You can't make that stuff up, right? But not only did I never hear of my church's involvement in an economy of enslavement, I keep turning pages going, really? Right? And so I want to go back. I'm going to go back real quick here, right? I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with my colleague, Brian Massingale, who does a lot of work, right, on racism in the Catholic Church. And one of the things I've been thinking with him about, right, is that those of us who have been on the beneficiaries of some of the reality of American Catholicism, right? We say, okay, this is a tradition that has shaped me, this is a tradition that has fed me, that we need the opportunity to sit in grief, right? And to really grieve over this history. Right? Not sweep it under the rug. And of course, if I get there, you'll see, right, the natural tendency to say, oh, let's not bring that up. Maybe that's a natural white tendency, I don't know. Let's not bring that up, right? It's just too painful. Let's just keep moving on, right? But the point of starting with this a more psychological lens on historic trauma, right, is that the sweeping under the rug, the ignoring, right, serves a particular function. And that being able to grieve, being able to tell the truth, being able to understand is the way that Braveheart says, we'll never create transformed institutions unless we do that work of telling the truth, of analyzing, of lamenting, and seeing if, right, we can move on. Okay, so those are two. Oh, my last point here. If we recognize that Catholics were enslaving other human beings and reaping wealth and benefits from that, where did that money go? Yeah, right? The number of churches, right, that had human property bequeathed to them, that had money from enslavement bequeathed to them, that, like, if we looked at the history of the Catholic Church in America, we would find a lot of slaveholding wealth, right, being funneled into the building of churches that still stand today, right? And so what do we do with that? That's just a question. Okay, so 2 volumes that I would recommend, 2 very different volumes, but I would still recommend them. And the fact that they have been published, I think they're both 2023, that means that we haven't reckoned with this history, right? The fact that we have to publish this history now means we haven't reckoned with it. Okay, so on the right is Rachel Swarns, who was the New York Times journalist who put on the front page of the New York Times the story of Georgetown's 1838 sale of 275 enslaved Catholics, right, in order to keep Georgetown afloat. That was in 1838. And what she does is she works with the archives and she works with oral history and she tries to reconstruct one family, right? And so this sense of all of the history that has been lost, right, because of the practices of denying enslaved Catholics their story, right, and her work kind of gives us a snapshot of one family's story, and also the Jesuit reasoning, the Jesuit practice, right, and the Jesuit, ultimately their sale of the enslaved people that were running their plantations. On the left is Chris Kellerman, a Jesuit, who does a really nice kind of a textual history. If you want to have a broader sense of what was the logic, what were the arguments, how did the church respond, Kellerman does a whole history from that perspective. 2 very different approaches, right? But the fact that they are both coming out at the same time means that maybe we are in a place, right, to finally reckon with this history. Okay. Here we are.
Keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going to finish out this one. No less difficult than the other 2, perhaps even more difficult because it becomes close to our own era. Would you like me to intervene with my theoretical?
Yes.
Okay, so here's my intervention with theory. Okay, a quick, so I named this last one the entrenchment and the protection of white interests. And I just find it helpful to just remind myself and remind my conversation partners that I'm following the work of critical race theorists in order to say that racism has been handed to us in America in a particular way, and it might not be the way that we're used to thinking about it, right? I think, at least Omi and Wynant and other scholars say, we're used to thinking about racism as an interpersonal reality, right? And as long as we're nice people, as long as we're nice to everyone, we can't be possibly in that basket of racists, right? And the critical race theorists say, okay, let me just give you 3 things to think about. 1, the categories of the races were constructed at a particular time. And we can do, we don't have time, but I could do this history, right? Looking at modern philosophical evolution of the races of humanity, right? That were always ordered hierarchically, and white was always at the top. And it was an Enlightenment project, but it kind of shaped colonialism and the whole modern period, right? right? To lead, it was supported then by race science, it was supported by popular imagination. It led people to believe that race was something biological, right? And the critical race theorists say that way of thinking about it just isn't accurate. We need to be more critical in relation to where we can see the ideas of race coming from. And so Omi and Wynant are the scholars that I'm following here. They say, look, the races, that was a functional fiction. We created these categories. That's the first step. Second step is people were sorted into them, right? On the basis of language, on the basis of religion, on the basis of the color of their skin, on the basis of phenotypical, on the basis of eyes, all of these different ways, right? But people were sorted into them. And then the third critical moment is that benefits were granted or withheld on the basis of the category that one was sorted into. Right? And they say that's a really, they propose that that's a really helpful way of seeing the history of race and racism in America as the protection of the interests of those who have been sorted into the category white. Right? We can go off in a couple different directions on that, but we're going to move forward with our discussion. Just to say that racism is not, in this way of thinking about it, it's not about whether or not you're a nice person. It's about having having received benefits or having benefits withheld on the basis of the race that you've been sorted into. Okay, so we'll keep that as a possible way of thinking about this, and we'll see if that's helpful. But as I move into this third moment that brings us up to closer to our time, I did go back and I put, people call them trigger warnings, others call them self-care warnings. I realized that there are images, there's at least one image coming up that is difficult to view. And I always get to this point and say, what's the right way of navigating? And we'll see if I've done the right way of navigating here. Okay, so the entrenchment and the protection of white property, right? The two eras that we're looking at here with the American Catholic Church potentially entrenched in the protection of white interests is an era that I think has been understudied, right? The sense of how the Catholic Church was supportive of Reconstruction or was resistant to that era of Reconstruction after enslavement had been abolished. Right? Where was the Catholic Church in that period when this vision of the possibilities of Reconstruction? So over here are the first black congressmen. Was that something that Catholic churches celebrated? Was that something that Catholic churches were behind and were encouraging? Right? Or was there resistance? Okay, so this is an understudied, maybe not just understudied out there, but also understudied on my part. I'm moving into the early 20th century. Right? And the studies that, and I have an article from the National Catholic Reporter here, that when you get the slides you can click on. The number of parishes in the early 20th century that felt it was within their right and their Catholicism to put on minstrel shows. Right? The number of them. So I have one here. This one was from Massachusetts. I'm sorry I don't have the date. But it was from the Holy Name Society of St. Bridget's Parish in Maynard, Massachusetts. This one here is from DePaul Academy in Chicago, and you can see the students being covered in blackface. Right? The idea, as I interpret it, that white Catholics understood themselves, right, to be perfectly able to caricature, right, because that's what blackface was doing, to caricature others, right, and by that caricature to distinguish themselves, right. I haven't done this study closely, but I think there are folks out there that are doing that, but that was a surprise to me, right, that this was something that a Holy Name men's club might put on or might sponsor. So, the close connection in time, so this is 1936, the minstrel shows. The close connection in time with what's pictured on the right, which is a 1930 lynching of two young black men, Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. When you follow this link, you hear interviews with people who remember being there. Right? And then you ask the question, among the white folks that are there, are are there Catholics, right? Because Marion, Indiana has its population of Catholic churches, right? So how do we face that history, especially as it's coming closer to, right, histories that might have actually been passed down in our own family stories? So I won't dwell there. I will talk about the expressions of racism as a cultural supremacy. Is that related to the violent enforcement of supremacy in the lynching, the project of lynching? But I also want to introduce in this period the structural and institutionalized expression of racism in the project of homeownership. Okay, so now we're moving into the ways in which land values were assessed according to a racial hierarchy. So this is, I brought my own McMichaels because I couldn't believe it. I said, oh, come on, really? Yeah, over 40 years of printing, right? You can turn to the page where they describe, yeah, for all you real estate men out there, that's what they called us back in the day. For the real estate industry, got coverage. Does anybody have a napkin? Or oh yeah, perfect. Oh, there we go. I know. Yeah. A good break, a good mental break there for a second. So in the era of the 1930s, right? After the New Deal, right? And the legislation that was going to help people make their way through the next economic dip, like the Great Depression. The Federal Housing Administration it wasn't erected, it was created, right? And the distribution of government funds through mortgage lending, right, is happening in this era, right? But at the time that the government is distributing money for families and individuals to purchase homes, right? Homer Hoyt is doing his study, 1933 he publishes it, and he says, if you see in the manual, he says, the classification that follows may be scientifically misleading from a standpoint of inherent racial characteristic, but Mr. Hoyt, the economist, avers that it registers an opinion or prejudice that's reflected in land values. And so you can see, it's a little bit fuzzy, but you can see the hierarchy of the races by which federal funds would be distributed, right? Withholding benefits from people who have been sorted into the category of South Italian, Negro, and Mexican in the way that they characterized it then. Right? And those who would enjoy the benefits of government funding to purchase homes, right? The English, German, Scotch, and Irish, Scandinavians, etc. Right? And try that again. And that this hierarchy, right, of racialization, this manual was copyrighted in 1931. The ninth printing was 1962. That structure of inequality still is reflected in our neighborhoods, right? This is not too far away, right? Okay. The WOW says we don't know this history, right? Even though it's a history that still impacts us today. Okay. When you get the slides, I very much encourage you to follow this link, which is an amazing resource from out of the University of Richmond, in which they have essentially created a map of the nation, and you can click on all of the individual locations, and you can find the redlining map by which neighborhoods were assessed, right? And so, right? The text in the middle is from 1996, a historian, John McGreevy, who really described the way that Catholic parishes were very much involved in refusing integration in their neighborhoods, right? So the protection of white property was also the protection of white parishes. And the number of examples that he offers in northern cities across the nation is really quite remarkable. On the left is Brian Massingale's Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, and on the right is a newer volume from Maureen O'Connell, also trying to face this history of ideologies and practices of white supremacy that have been woven into 5 generations of her Catholic family, right? That these texts are coming out in the late 20th century and early 21st century means that we don't share a common understanding of this history yet, right? Okay, so I'm late, and we'll work on, I know what I need to do next, but let me ask if there are clarifying questions that might help us better understand the history. So the first time through this history, I was like, oh, that can't be true. That can't be true. There were so many parts of this history 10 years ago when I had to relearn history, right? Because this was not part of my own training. But when I started to relearn this history, I was like, oh, you must be exaggerating on that one. And then I find documents and I'm like, oh, this really is, right? The history of my own church's involvement in structures, systems, practices of racism and white supremacy. Are there clarifying questions that would give me a little bit of a breather and you a little bit of time to chew on some things? Yeah, go ahead.
With Catholic Church, especially after Civil War, were the other Christian communities in a parallel situation?
Yeah, of course. I'm just pausing because I'm formulating. The answer that I'm formulating isn't right on with the period that you're talking about, right? So the answer that I'm formulating right now, again, I think it comes from Magritte, and it's more just prior to abolition, the abolition movement, right? That in the abolition movement we see prominent figures from other denominations, but we see very few prominent figures from the Catholic tradition, right? That's all I can say is that I know that that is data there, that a historian has kind of looked at that. In terms of Reconstruction, I don't know enough about the details of the history of Reconstruction and that era, right, to know what was going on in other, so blackface, were there other parish communities, white parish communities that adopted that practice? That I don't know. Other elements of, so when we get up to the redlining era, Magritte really makes a strong case that American Catholics felt as though in the early part of the 20th century and into the 60s, 70s, that they had finally made it, right? And they really wanted to protect their property. That's the argument that he makes in that parish boundaries. So I would absolutely not say, oh yeah, no, Catholics were the only one. I do think that historians are trying to see what the particular Catholic form of this racism and white supremacy, and other communities are doing their own, histories, and really kind of looking and saying. I just read one that was an Episcopal. I think in the Episcopal Church, they have it's not quite a mandate. They have a widespread commitment to knowing their local histories and to asking the question, what was my church doing in each of these eras? So that was, I don't have the answer to your question. I gave you a whole lot of other stuff, but I'm sorry. There was a.
Well, from the outside, has looking at other countries, especially Romania, helped you in any way with how the Catholic Church behaved?
So I have found it necessary for myself to relearn my own American history. I haven't done any of the comparative work, but I did. If I fast forward to my very last slide. I did just read a book that's about to come out by a scholar, Joel something Goza, G-O-Z-A. And what he does in that book is two things related to your question. He says, look, Germany and South Africa, right, if we're thinking about racism embedded in these national histories, we can say, yes, racism embedded in those national histories. But both of those nations have undertaken some form of truth and reconciliation, right? The other thing that he does, which other scholars have done, is he elevates the fact that the architects of Nazi Germany were actually studying the U.S. project, right, as a way of having an architecture for doing what they were doing. We don't know that history.
They thought it was too straight.
Right? The chills on that, right? Me too, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of a clarification question. You referred to those bishops writing their rationalization, and you used the word miscellany?
Yeah,
How do you
I
spell that?
so it's like old-fashioned. It must mean like miscellaneous things in the 1830s, like miscellany. It's M-I-S-C-E-L-L-A-N-Y, maybe the U.S. Catholic miscellany. But if you look for the letters to the Secretary of State was John Forsyth, and I think it was Bishop England from Charleston who wrote those letters. And then, I mean, I can send you, I actually can, I can send you the editorial, right? The editorial where he condensed, this is the next, I think it's Ignatius Reynolds is the next bishop of Charleston, condenses those 16 letters. But, you know, okay, I brought one that's a little bit out of date. But like if we studied the catechisms of the time, if we studied the moral theologians, Henrik, the Bishop of Philadelphia, had a moral theology that essentially they defend, right? The right of superior. This one is after. Emancipation, but they defend the rights of superiors over those who are the overseers of them. Right? Well, if you have that language even after emancipation, even if that language was as not direct as saying slave and master, although the bishops did say that, right? Archbishop John Hughes, who founded my own institution in New York City, he said, all power comes from God, even the power of husband over wife, of parent over children, of master over slave. Right? And so the hierarchy of the Catholic Church was one of the features that some scholars will say sort of made it natural for Catholic slavers to buy into that project. How did we get? Did that answer your question? Yeah, go ahead.
So in Akron in the 1950s, down under the Howard Street Bridge was a little St. Peter Claver mission of some sort. Were these black parishes or black missions? Were they sort of perpetuating, like, let's give them a place to go so they won't bother us here?
Sometimes, yeah. Probably, and it's a great question to ask, what do we do in understanding the history, right? Because sometimes they were the function of let's keep our black Catholics right in their own space. But also sometimes if we study them from the inside, they were very life-giving spaces for black Catholics, right? And so how do we think together as white Catholics and as black Catholics, as historians and theologians, like that it's not an either or, it's really complex and mixed. But that, yeah, we had our own patterns. The Catholic Church in America had its own patterns of segregation, right? And the fact that you described it as a mission. I've been studying a church in South Carolina. It's the longest, I think it's the longest standing black Catholic church in existence. It's in competition with one in New Orleans. And it was called a mission. I think it's still called a mission. Right? What does that mean? That these locations of Catholic gathering are described as mission, perpetually in mission. What is that? Right now we're going to get into that. What does that say? That the black Catholic congregations are perpetually in mission. Does that suggest that the white Catholics have a better understanding? Right? And that we're always, okay, all right. That is not my area of expertise, so a little rabbit hole there. Other questions? Yeah.
been educating myself, and I read that 20% of the slaves that came from Africa were Catholic.
Oh, yeah.
And so when it came to the doctrine of discovery about not encountering any disciples, they encountered a lot of those. So I read, and this is what I like to comment about in every month, that the institutional church tried to negate the baptism of those Catholics.
I don't know. I haven't studied that. Perhaps I have to wrap my brain to
Well,
see
you got a
if
new book now.
But so on this Black Catholic parish from South Carolina, so if anyone has ever heard of St. James the Greater in Colleton County, South Carolina, you would have probably heard it from Sean Copeland, who is a Black Catholic theologian, and Cyprian Davis, who was a Black Catholic historian. And they describe what is remarkable about this congregation, that it was founded as a church for the planters, for the white Catholics. The enslaved Black Catholics became part of the community. The white Catholics sort of drifted away to another parish. It was founded in, I want to say, 26 or 30. They had a fire in 1856. And the church building was never rebuilt, and the diocese ignored them for 40 years. In the 1890s, they are rediscovered, and they still are visibly Catholic in their practice, in their understanding, in their identity, and they're reestablished. Okay. When that Black Catholic parish was nominated for the place, what is it called? This place of historic registry. That's not right, but for the historic registry. The scholar there describes, right, that there were Congolese Catholics, right, who were enslaved and who may have brought their Catholicism with them to Charleston, and that St. James the Greater was a patron saint in the Congo, and that affirmation of St. James the Greater here. So I don't have an answer to your question about the church refusing to recognize the baptism, but I do have an answer in terms of what is the rich history that you know. So in much of the modern construction of religiosity in Africa was just that there was no religion, right? And so that mindset, right, probably makes its way into thinking about Black Catholic parishes as perpetually in mission. Right? And certainly would be woven into any study that kind of looked at, you know, was there, yeah, I don't know, right? You know, local church, American church, global church, you know, what was the relationship between what might have been going on by the enslavers, and what did the church have to say about that whole wide history, right, that I think we have opportunities to expand our understanding. Yeah.
Do you have information about racism in women's religious orders? So women.
I do not, but you know who does. Finish your thought. Go ahead.
So young women entering the convent would bring with them their slaves.
So the next speaker on your list, Shannon D. Williams, who I mentioned earlier, she has a book called Subversive Habits. And she's looking at that history, and she's done a number of I don't know if any of them have been taped online, but it's again, and that volume came out just 2, maybe 3 years ago, right? So that this history was always part of the church, but it has not been really reckoned with, right? And she, of course, highlights the racism within the religious orders, right, that kept women of color from really being full participants often, right? But then she also has remarkably wonderful histories. I don't know, I'm opening up a little rabbit hole. And that is that you may or may not know the Congregation of Women Religious, the Oblate Sisters of Providence. African-American, Baltimore, one of the very earliest American congregation of women religious. They were women of color. They were serving the excluded in Baltimore, okay, 1830s. At one point, one of those women was invited out to the mission in Monroe, Michigan, right? And she travels and helps to seed the church in Monroe, Michigan, but she could pass as white. And that is where, I think they're called Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, IHM Sisters. They denied her, they denied her identity as a woman of color for much of their history, right? And they are a largely white congregation today, right? How did I get there? Right, just the tangle of these stories, right? Of racialization and the way that the church participated in that. I just think we have a much more mind-blowing experience to be looking at, right? And I think that if we're ever going to be truthful about U.S. Catholic history, we have to do some of this work. Okay, I do not want to not do my last set. You guys are going to be... Well, this part is hard, as if the other part wasn't hard. This part is hard. This part is where we say, yes, that's a national history. Yes, we need to know more about it. But do we know how that national history touches down in our locations, right? So part of the book that I'm working on really kind of says, look, the first step is knowing the history. But then sometimes the way we know history, we go, oh my gosh, it's all out there. It's in the South, right? It's in the past. It's out there, and I gotta face it, but it really doesn't have anything to do with me. And the theoretical framing, I don't know whether it will catch on, but I'm thinking about the institutional inheritance that I, as a white Catholic, have from out of structures and systems of white supremacy. The land that my institutions have been built on, the money that my institutions have gathered from an economy of enslavement, and the protection of white interests that I can see the parishes, the institutions that I have gained benefit from, having participated in. Okay. So if you take a deep breath, so over the last 5 or 7 years that I've been working on this, I get like this, I get very tense, right? All of this lands on me. And I've been working with that group of nuns and nuns, the land justice folks, who just say, okay, make sure you're taking care of yourself, right? And take a nice deep breath, because this is hard. Okay. And on one of those calls last week, 2 weeks ago, the Indigenous organizer said, okay, here's my proposal for you. Between now and the next time we meet, go find out about the conditions under which your land was transferred. Do you know what treaties were put in place? What treaties were broken? Do you know the conditions under which the land on which your institution stands, right, was transferred from Indigenous people, right? So I Googled a few things. And this history is out there, right? I think that at this stage, there is so much of this history out there that we just need to carve out the time and ask the question. So, my question to you, do you know the conditions under which the land on which you reside was transferred? So I just found a little visual online. Okay, the original keepers of the land were Shawnee, they were Kickapoo. We can see with this map that I started out with, right, a similar naming, where are we, right? A similar naming, but then also more specific tribal identities, right, that would have been a particular culture and language and way of life, right, that this kind of is that portrait here. Okay. I discovered, anybody, is this covered in your Ohio history? The 1795 Greenville Treaty? Anyone heard of that? Your national, oh good, all right, good. Your National Park Service has a nice little link that you can go to. But I didn't realize, right, that the transfer of Indigenous people was not just the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. I think that's the Trail of Tears, right? But the 1795 Greenville Treaty designated this part of this land. I'm not sure I have the history exactly right, but that some of the forced migration, right, in the late 18th century, right, brought not only Shawnee and Kickapoo, but now Lenape and Seneca and Cherokee, right? That this was land that was designated as now Indian territory, right? So the Greenville Treaty of 1795, here's Cleveland up here, right? And this blue here is what the Native Nations, that was their secession. That's what they agreed that they would give over to the United States, right? What was becoming an emerging nation. And I found the language of that treaty, Article 4, that the United States relinquishes their claim to all other Indian lands northward of the Ohio River, except for this section, right? Eastward of the Mississippi and westward and southward of the Great Lakes and waters. The treaty was signed by George Washington and passed in Congress, but a mere 5 years later, the 1800 Harrison Land Act essentially said, oh, we're going to pass an act providing for the sale of the lands of the United States in the territory north and west of the Ohio and above the mouth of the Kentucky River. Right? So you have a treaty, and what the indigenous scholars and activists draw attention to is that this is a treaty between sovereign nations, right? That this is a treaty that the U.S. said, yeah, that's how we're going to do business, right? And then 5 years later, breaks that treaty, right? And that's just one, right, of many, many broken treaties. I just threw this last one in here just now because I remembered that William Henry Harrison, as governor of Indiana, really was mobilizing a religious argument, right? And so he and others, Christian legislators of the time, essentially looked out on the land and said, what he said, the fairest portion of the globe remaining in a state of nature, the haunt of a few wretched savages, when it seems destined by the Creator to give support to a large population, to be the seat of civilization, of science, and of true religion, right?
Yeah.
And another deep breath. Okay. Because that idea of bringing civilization and bringing religion through religion was not just a random Christian legislator in the early part of the 19th century, but the project of Catholic boarding schools and generating money for Catholic boarding schools, published in the Indian Sentinel, which was the magazine of the Catholic Indian Bureau from 1902 to 1961. And I had already had this, and I went back, I said, oh yeah, that was the Bishop of Cleveland, who insisted that his letter be read at all of the parishes, asking for money in order to support the missions in the Indian schools. And he says, I'm sorry it's cut off, he says, shall the grand work of so many years be allowed to die out for want of support? This is the 1902. He's having this read in all of the parishes of his diocese. He says, all who have investigated the Catholic schools admit that the Catholic plan for the civilization of the Indians is the only practical one. So these are not just ideas that are out there in our history. These are ideas that were mobilized from our pulpits, right? And I know you heard about my grandma of beloved memory. This does not come from her, but she was a faithful Catholic. And she gave money regularly to the causes that her bishops invited her to. I found this in an antique shop in Vermont. The reach of, right, this was one of the, it's inside, it's a, oh, I have it here. Inside it's a rosary. Right, and it's, I'm sure there were thousands of faithful Catholics who understood that God desired for them to bring mission to the native people, right? But the language of civilization and the language of true religion, that's deeply embedded in Catholic theological outlook. So, another deep breath. And we're going to do just one more, I think, right? So this is a volume, I think this is from the early 2000s, that is doing interviews with survivors of Catholic Indian boarding schools. Yeah, I think all of them are Catholic Indian boarding schools. There might be other thrown in there as well. But just like, do we know this history? Have we repented of this history? Is there any way of making a repair? Systems of slavery. I didn't do a very good job, I'll be honest with you. I didn't do a very good job of organizing this. But the point that I wanted to raise was, the main point I want to raise on Cleveland in this landscape is that you truly have a history of struggle and of telling your history of struggle. If you look around what's available in news outlets, you will see a lot of elevation of the fact that the Underground Railroad was supported right through Cleveland, right? And so then we would have to look and see, were there Catholic parishes that were helping the self-emancipated, right, make their way to permanent freedom, right? Or were there Catholic parishes or Catholics, right, who were rounding into that fugitive slave codes, the fugitive slave law, right? And some of the studies of Catholic ideology in this time really see the way that Catholic theologians and bishops and pastors, right, envisioned law and order as being a really important thing, right? And so the sense in which we might find a very competing histories, right, of whether which side were the Catholic communities on. The celebration of Ohio never having been a slave state, right, a free state, but it was a free state with black laws that refused the migration of free people of color, right? And so this sense of, we have this history that we want to celebrate the liberatory dimensions, right, but does that erase the dimensions that were not liberatory? Can't remember what's on my next slide. Oh yeah, this is my super unscientific, right? So I have not done the history of slavery in relation to Cleveland. What I do know about many cities founded in the same era as Cleveland was founded is that money that was built in a slave economy, right, was funneled, right, through wealthy settlers in these various places. I haven't done the history, but I did check Facebook. And I thought that it was a really great snapshot, right, of a possible true history to follow, which in capital letters, right, General Moses Cleveland, the founder of Cleveland, was a slave owner. He used slaves to carry his exploration equipment. He murdered and stole land from the Seneca, Cayuga, and the Lenape Native Northern Ohio tribes. With this blood stain on Cleveland, the city needs to be renamed and its memorial statue torn down. I don't know if any of that is true. This is Facebook, remember, right? But those are openings to historical questions, right? And those historical questions could be answered. But I included the reply. I hope Melanie's not in the room. Well, even if Melanie is in the room, that would be okay, right? And Melanie responds to the original poster. Although it is an ugly truth, I'm sure every city has its bad stories. Nothing can come from focusing on negativity. Right? And so then I think a lot of this work is really trying to wrestle with, right, that emotional response that says, can't we all just get along, right? And that's why I think that model from Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart is actually quite helpful to me, right? Because sometimes I find myself in that place of saying, yeah, you're right, let's not bring up that bad history, right? And it's this sense of, well, we're not telling the truth then, right? We're not telling the truth of what happened. So, in any case, that's my cover over of the fact that I didn't do much there. Because I spent a little bit of time going a little bit more deeply into John McGreevy, right? And this practice of redlining, right? And McGreevy has quite a few examples from Cleveland. And again, it's a multifaceted history, right? Where he is able to say, and there were parishes and there were priests who were part of the vanguard in terms of the interracial commission in the Catholic Church, right? So part of my history does focus on those things that have been swept under the rug, and so it does sometimes leave us like, oh, there was never anything good going on. There were good things going on, and McGreevy does a nice balanced history in doing that. In order to set up the next slide, I wanted his expert description that in 1943, a representative of the Cleveland Real Estate Board could casually ask Bishop Hoban for his assistance in blocking federal housing for African Americans, right? You could approach the bishop casually as a real estate person and say, hey, do we have your help? Right, blocking housing for African Americans. And he has a quote from one of those real estate folks, adding, quote, that many of the priests in the area have attended meetings that have been trying to combat the idea of locating such an African American development there. This is Vigrivi's words as well. 10 years later, Cleveland residents attacked the home of the first African American to move into an area of the city estimated to be 70% Catholic. 10 years after 1943 is 1953. I was born in 1969, and that's coming close to my entering this story. But I would imagine that some of you might have stories of your own from this era. Right? And have we shared those stories? Have we reckoned with those stories? Okay. But because I love mapping inequality, that website, I think I've gotten the right location. Is Wade Park still a thing?
Yeah.
Is it right down the street? Okay, then I am. Hold that little book where I am, right? So I got right there, right? And you'll notice that both D20 and D21 are coded red, right? That is the code, that is the shading of the map that says this is a hazardous area, right? And what you see on the next slide is what you'll see on mapping inequality, the form that was used all the way across the nation. I mean, one of the things that is helpful in doing this history is that in this era, racism was not particularly coded. You didn't use dog whistles, you just said, is there infiltration? You asked the question, are there foreign families, right? And in the typewritten words, you named, and it happens all the way across the nation, you named that this area here, right, has been developed, right? And we're going to describe the peoples, right, from the period of 1920 to 1930. Colored infiltration came in very strongly along the thoroughfares of Cedar in the north and Quincy in the south, almost totally colored now. I don't know where those, do you guys know those? And then, right at the end, so the website has this scan, but as you see here, it's continued on the following page, and they don't have the next page of the scan, but they have rewritten what it says, and what it said on that scan. And he said, the assessor writes, this trend for the area, now about 99% built up, is definitely downward, since colored infiltration from 4th grade area to the rest will continue strongly, very heavy during the past 3 years. And this is the one that I wanted us to sit with. There is a concerted effort being made by the better class colored in this section to locate in the 4th grade area along East 105th north of Wade Park. But institutions have agreed not to sell to them.
Institutions.
What are those institutions? Where are those?
Could you go back to that map that had the weight oval, just to make it really, one more, I think.
Yeah, I
Really
can't.
personal and painful.
Yeah.
We all love the Cleveland Clinic. Guess where the Cleveland Clinic is? That's almost the outline, I'm exaggerating. But the Cleveland Clinic, our beloved Cleveland Clinic,
When was it established? When was it there? When was it built there?
1920-something, where the existing campus is today, which is a mammoth campus. The original building is still there. And it was the Cryle, Dr. Cryle.
So is that one of the institutions that was refusing infiltration, or was it, sometimes what we see is an institution that benefited, right, by claiming land because they had the resources to claim the land that was otherwise devalued,
right?
but I just
When
don't
you devalue
know.
it, then the
Yeah.
institutions can come in and
Right.
get it at bargain prices. You know, that's, but you say that's the way capitalism works, right?
Yeah.
But it's worth pointing out, 'cause, I mean, I love the Cleveland Clinic, right?
No.
But
is what you said, it's getting close, right?
Yeah.
That there's a reason the Cleveland Clinic is there and not in a place where the land is more valuable and harder to retain. And
So the idea of one way of thinking about the idea of institutionalized racism is simply the fact that institutions benefited from these racial projects and that the institution served some people who had been racialized in the category of white and were not serving other. So yeah. Okay.
Going back to 1830s to 1846, when you're talking about local history, there was a treaty, and I don't know exactly the year, but it was in that window, and it was stated that all Native Americans had to leave Ohio, and for any of those who chose not to leave, they would no longer be considered Native American in any way. They were not counted, they were not certified, they were not registered, and so it was as if, even if they stayed here and put up a teepee in Olmsted Township in 1870, still had Native Americans living in teepees, but they were no longer considered in terms of census. The little hashtags, now people wanted their names on the census, Native Americans were not included.
Do those histories make their way into our curriculum?
No.
Right? And then people say, oh, well, we don't want to upset the kids, right? It's like, well, when's the right time, right? Yeah.
There's a member of the community, Charlie Michaels, grew up in Tulsa,
Mm.
and he was never told about the massacre in the 20s.
He said that you have a member of your congregation who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was never told about the massacre.
I bet a lot of people here don't know about the massacre. Does everyone know about the massacre?
Yeah.
Just saying, come on.
So we're back in the, I gotta go way back. We're back in the era of, sorry, I'm going way back here. We're in the era of Reconstruction and the Lynch era, right? So after emancipation, the governmental programs to create opportunities for the formerly enslaved, but then also the rising up of self-sufficient black communities in Rosewood, Florida, in Tulsa, in other places, right? So the sense that after emancipation, that the possibility of sovereign, I don't think sovereign is quite the right word, but freestanding black communities, right, that were building up wealth, that were professionalizing, that had all of these ways of kind of creating community with resources, right? But that in the beginning part of the 20th century, I want to say it's like 1909, and then it's 1910, and then it's 1915, and then it's 1920, you have reports, historical reports of, quote, race riots, right? And what scholars today really look at and they say, those were not race riots, right? That was white mob action targeting black communities, right? And often black communities that were thriving, right? And so Tulsa is one of those places where you had a black Wall Street, where you had self-sufficiency, where you had the buildup of wealth, and then you have the Tulsa Massacre. And I'm sorry that I don't know the history to know what there's always sort of an event that sparks it. I don't know what the event was.
A young black man was accused of whistling at a white woman.
There was a young man who evidently stepped on the foot of a white woman in an elevator. And then that became that he had attacked her, which was, of course, what the excuse that was used to destroy the story.
So my framing here, and why the story, which might have been the story of Emmett Till, right, but it also might have been the story of Thomas Shipp, or it might have been the story of what happened in Rosewood, or it might have been the story. It's the same sort of a pattern where a cultural supremacy, right, sets off a reaction of violent enforcement, right? Whether that's targeting individuals or whether that's targeting whole communities. I didn't know Tulsa, I didn't know about that when I was growing up, right? I never heard of Rosewood until I was doing this research. So it's not just Tulsa, right? It's actually also Omaha, right? I think it's called the Red Summer. Omaha, Chicago, I think Minneapolis, right? Where we can see historically, right? Again, what were named as race riots. It's like, well, that's one way of framing it if you're trying to serve, right, a particular way of viewing what was going on. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking currently, I have sisters that go to suburban Catholic churches out in the burbs. They seem to be supporting Trump, you know, and he's like a racist. And they're telling me these things I can't believe. You know?
Can you please repeat?
Pardon me?
What she said, we couldn't hear.
Suburban churches around Cleveland, my sisters are going to some of them, and they seem to be supporting Trump, and, I mean, he's a no racist, you know, I just feel like it's still,
So,
I don't know.
no, I think so this is what, if you read, so Goza, let me get to Goza here. You'll see the cover is his volume at least. Sorry, gives you a headache, but here we go.
I don't find that as much in the inner city Catholic
Here we go.
churches.
Here we go, right? Joel Edward Goza, it's coming out soon, Rebirth of a Nation, Reparations and Remaking America. But to your point, you've just added on a chapter of history that is our chapter of history, right? And what Goza does so skillfully is he just lays down the pattern from earlier eras, right? And then he shows the way that in our era, we call them dog whistles, right? You don't have to be overtly racist, right? You don't use the language that they used in the 1930s and 40s, right? But it's the pattern of dehumanization. It's the pattern of racialization with another set of words. But the point that you led in with there, I don't know if we have time to, not tonight, but I don't know if we have time to do this in the next month. But I think as part of a Catholic tradition, we have to understand, right? I think that it was like 50% of white Catholic women voted for Trump, at least, if not more, right? And so what is that, right? How are we not only polarized as a nation, we're polarized as a church, but also, like, is there an opportunity to learn, right? Think of your sisters, right? What is going on, and how might we envision a different way of getting there, right? Than the way that the candidate that you've named, right, appears to be trying to get there with the playbook that we've seen throughout U.S. history, right? Which is elevating folks who have been racialized as white and demonizing folks in dog whistles in other ways. But so in doing this history, one of the things, I don't think, I should have had that movement of those Maria Yellow Horse Parade card. I don't know what I'm doing. It won't let me move at all. That the whole idea of studying the history, from my perspective, from studying the history to analyzing it is to understand what are the patterns, right? What are the patterns that even I might fall into, even I, listen to me, even I might fall into, right? My own institution, right? White people are not racist because they are evil people, although it does drive them to do evil things. They're racist because they have been shaped in a way of seeing the world of white supremacy, right? Brian Massingale, my colleague, describes that as he has a better way of saying it, something about a disease of our vision, right? And white supremacy, right, when I was growing up, I'll give you two generational stories. When I was growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, there was language of white supremacy. We didn't call it white supremacy. We weren't the KKK, right? But we had a sense that white Catholics were just better than, right? People in the city. Do we mean black people? Do we mean poor people? Do we mean immigrants? What is that, right? Second, I got into this work with early on with McGreevy and his description of those parishes that were kind of blocking integration into neighborhoods. And my mom on the south side of Chicago, she said, "Oh yeah, I remember." And I'm like, "How do you remember that? Like, did they announce it in the announcements at the end of Mass that the bingo money was going to purchase this plot of land so that black families couldn't move in?" And so I said, historically reconstructing that, I'm guessing that didn't happen, but my mom had the sense that, well, everyone knew that that's where the bingo money was going, right? I go, "Mom, what kind of racist church were you part of?" And then I read McGreevy's work, and I was like, no, that's a pattern. That's a pattern of white Catholic churches defending their property in the early 20th and mid 20th century. Yeah.
My question is, it's kind of a big question, but do you see anything in the theological imagination of like Catholic slaveholders and Catholic, from the past that justified kind of racism? Any like deep theological imagination ideas that you think are still present in our theological imagination today?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have been advancing is the idea that Christian supremacy and white supremacy have really been mutually informing in our nation. I know I'm being taken. Christian nationalism, but also that the official stance of the Catholic Church still retains a Catholic supremacy, right? You might hear that from pulpits, right? So I think that the ideology of Christian or Catholic supremacy, I think that's still even just opening my ears sometimes. I'm like, wait a minute, right? You're drawing forward doctrine and you're saying, yeah, we got to follow this, and it's like, yeah, but don't you see where that leads in terms of Christian supremacy? And do you see the way that has underwritten white supremacy? So Christian supremacy is one. I don't know. I think that there is lingering white Christian centeredness in our church, in power structures, in curriculum, that just kind of presumes, well, if it came from Europe, right, that's properly Catholic, probably. If it came from other places, you might have to look at that a little bit more closely. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm also thinking I've read kind of accounts of Catholic slaveholders, and they talk a lot about diminishing like the human existence and elevating the spiritual existence, and like it's good that these Catholic enslaved folks are still receiving sacraments and things like that. Like, I'm really saving them. And I feel like we still kind of have that kind of view of prioritizing, the sacramental and not diminishing the human experience.
And the it's not really a flip, but the way that I would take that is to say, in that same pattern of saying, well, what it is to be Christian, to be Catholic, is about the elevation of the spiritual, right? In the structures of enslavement, the Catholic rhetoric was, we're going to be nice and kind in that structure and in that system, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Didn't mean demolish the system of slavery. It meant if you were enslaved, you should be treating your enslaved workers as if you were enslaved, right? Not changing the system, but being kind within it. Does that make sense? That's the logic from that period. I think that same pattern of saying, look, Catholicism, Christianity, our congregation, we're about the spiritual. As long as we're nice to each other, that's all we really need to be doing, right? Leaving the structures and the systems of economic inequality, of educational inequality, of housing inequality, right? Leaving the structures and systems in place, and that way of framing racism as an interpersonal thing right? Like, oh, as long as I'm nice to people, I'm not racist. It's like, well, how about the fact that I work at a white-serving institution, right? How about the fact that we're always struggling with the fact, with the structures and systems that elevate white cultural forms, right? How about those structural realities that even if I'm a nice person, I probably am grounded in ideologies, structures, and systems of white supremacy that benefit me. And so I think that sense of leaving the structures intact and just being nice people, that was part of the slaving ideology, is something that we need to think about today, right? That thinking about looking at this history, not just to be nice people, although that's a good thing, to be nice people, but to actually look at the structures and systems and ask ourselves the question, where do I have an entry point, right, to address this history? Right? Whether that is in knowing the history better, whether that is in studying the history more fully, whether that is in looking at the outcomes of that history in terms of inequalities, right? But if we're saying that maybe it's time to reckon with this history, there's a ton of work to be done, right? And there's not one thing, there's hundreds of thousands of things. And I think that I am saying, you know I could go on and on. But I am saying that it's 8:30.
Take two more questions.
There were two, he said that. That says take two more questions. Oh, there's also someone in the back who hasn't had a question yet, so.
This is just kind of a forward, working on this. I'm a pastor of a Catholic parish that's in an inner-ring suburb. We've been trying to do a lot of work in this area for about 3 years now. We have a racial equity task force, conversations, dinners. But when we talk about healing, can you direct me to anybody that, like ritually or that there's work being done in that area that we could maybe look to?
So there's two things, I wish I had thought to put them on here. This is not from a Catholic perspective, but Quan and Thompson are doing this from a Christian theological perspective. And so they, one of the helpful things with this volume is they describe this history as theft in a number of ways. Theft of history, theft of identity, theft of power, theft of wealth. And so in that structure, they then introduce in the last part of the book kind of some ways in which Catholic or Christian congregations, right, can be really wrestling with those forms of theft and then forms of repair. Second volume that's not recent, but Joseph Barnt has a volume that is called Becoming an Anti-Racist Church. This is like 20 years old, I think, at this stage. But he's got some really practical sorts of things in terms of shifting power and shifting liturgical expression, etc. Two recent volumes, both within the Jesuit Catholic conversation. One is Patrick St. John's The Spiritual Exercises and Racism, or something like that. Patrick St. John has two different ones. I think that's his last name. I will add a slide and then I'll get this out to everyone. And then there is another one, I think it is Jesuit. It's called Praying for Freedom, and it is it's within the last year, and it's an edited volume of Catholic ethicists, theologians, kind of investigating what sort of resources there are for thinking forward. I'm sure that there are more folks who have done this kind of liturgically out there somewhere. I'd have to look a little bit. A great question though, and thank you for doing the work. Yeah, that's my vision is that we've got all of these Catholic parishes and institutions across the nation, right? As a nation shrinks from its commitment to anti-racism, right? I don't know what the legislation is in Ohio, but there's legislation across the nation that's saying you can't teach this in my school. I think Catholic institutions of congregation, community, church and school should be stepping into that and saying, this is our faith, right, to be part of this repair. So thank you for the model that's being undertaken. Should we leave it there with that hopeful note?
Yes.
Okay, let's leave it